Hi everyone, my name is Daniel, and I'm going to be talking about disadvantages. So we'll do two things. First, we'll go over what is a disad, going over the strategy and the component parts. And second of all, we will go over how to answer disadvantages so that you can implement that effectively as an affirmative. So the component parts of a disadvantage, there are four. Uniqueness, link, internal link, so this one, as we will see later, is optional, and impact. So we're going to go over why these concepts are important via an example. So uniqueness is a claim about the status quo that says, God damn it. I need to stop. I need to cut that out.
You're doing video editing of this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it'll be fine. Yeah, you can just keep the camera rolling. It doesn't matter. We'll edit stuff out.
There's going to be so many cuts to weird things.
Oh, I know. It's going to be so strange. So here I'll introduce. Hang on.
Claim. Switch between claim and works.
It's okay. Here I will introduce the component parts of a disad. The first is uniqueness. The second is the link. The third is the internal link, and finally is the impact. Uniqueness says that, whatever is happening in the status quo, it's not true. It's like, how do I explain uniqueness right away without introducing, there's no way to define, I don't think there's a way to define uniqueness without using an example, because, so I should just use the example to introduce these things.
You should say, briefly, so, even if it doesn't capture the full
Right.
essence, but so, uniqueness boils down to a claim about what is happening now.
Okay, sure. All right. So the four parts I will discuss are uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact. Uniqueness essentially boils down to a claim about what is happening in the status quo. The link explains how what the AF does changes the status quo. The internal link and the impact are just further links from the original link chain about what the plan does to reasons why that causes a lot of kind of bad impacts or bad harms. God damn it, that was so bad. Yeah. Okay, I'll do it again. So the four parts of the disad are uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact. Uniqueness essentially boils down to a claim about what is happening in the status quo. A link explains how what the plan does changes whatever is happening in the status quo, or in the previous section. An internal link is just a connection between the link and the final impact of the disadvantage, and the impact is just the bad things that happen as a result of the plan. So I think it would be helpful to go over this using a specific example. So let's say that the plan is that we should build natural gas plants in the United States. So the disadvantage would claim that, that would lead to higher carbon emissions, more global warming, and potentially extinction as a result of global warming. So let's kind of pick apart and pick out the components of the disadvantage that need to be here in order for it to make sense as an argument. So uniqueness needs to talk about how there aren't a lot of natural gas plants already. So if there isn't a lot of natural gas production, that's a claim about the status quo. The link would say that the plan builds lots of natural gas plants. So it explains why the affirmative is different from the status quo. The link and the internal links are, that leading to higher carbon emissions, leading to more global warming, and leading to extinction. And extinction is the terminal impact, or the final thing that happens as a result of the plan. So the thing that is important to remember is that every argument in the link chain also has an implicit uniqueness assumption. What I mean by a uniqueness assumption is that every argument about, what happens as a result of a policy or what impact occurs assumes something about that impact in the status quo. So when we say that building natural gas plants leads to higher carbon emissions, we're assuming that carbon emissions right now aren't super high already. Because if carbon emissions were really high, and that led to a slightly higher level of carbon emissions, it wouldn't matter as much. Whereas if carbon emissions are pretty low, and we significantly increase them, that matters a lot. In the same way, there's a uniqueness assumption about extinction, for example, when being made in this disad. The disad assumes that extinction is not happening already. Because if it were, it wouldn't make a difference whether we talked about the status quo or the plan. Because if the plan makes extinction happen, but extinction's already going to happen, it's non-unique. So these are the parts of the disad. This is generally how a disad is structured. You need to have a claim about the status quo, explanation of why the AF deviates from the status quo, and then kind of a link chain that leads to some sort of terminal impact. Now, I will explain how to answer disads, and there are several strategies involved here. The first strategy involves making a link turn and controlling uniqueness. I'll explain what these words are in a little bit. So a link turn is just a familiar term to you, which is just flipping the link in a disad. So instead of saying that building natural gas plants leads to higher carbon emissions, a link turn would say that building natural gas plants leads to lower emissions. So that's the first strategy, a link turn. An important thing to add here is you need to control uniqueness. What do I mean by this? Controlling uniqueness means making a claim, or rather the opposite claim, from what the disad makes about the status quo. So for instance, if the link turn is building natural gas plants actually reduces carbon emissions, you need to explain why carbon emissions are actually really high right now. So for the same reason that the original disadvantage needs to say that carbon emissions are low and that the plan is making them higher, the link turn, or the offensive argument that the AF is making, needs to say that carbon emissions are really high and that the plan is actually making them lower. Otherwise, the argument is still non-unique. So if you just make the link turn, to recap, you will say that building natural gas plants leads to lower carbon emissions. But if the original uniqueness claim remains, that means that carbon emissions are already really low. So lowering them further isn't a big deal. So the argument is a little bit of offense for you, but not that much. So if you want to make a turn to a disad that effectively gives you a substantial amount of offense, you need to always control uniqueness. A second strategy, a defensive one, is making another claim about uniqueness called uniqueness overwhelms the link. So in this strategy, you would be conceding that building natural gas plants leads to higher carbon emissions, but you could say that carbon emissions are already so high that it doesn't really matter. Whether we, or rather, controlling uniqueness would be an explanation of why carbon emissions are very high. But controlling uniqueness overwhelms the link would be an explanation of why carbon emissions are so low and that their uniqueness is so true that making them higher doesn't actually matter. So if global warming only matters, or if emissions only start to matter past a certain threshold, your claim is that right now emissions are so low that they overwhelm the link, in that that building natural gas plants won't actually create a substantial difference. So that is uniqueness overwhelms the link. You obviously can't control uniqueness and make uniqueness overwhelms the link arguments at the same time, because one is saying that no, carbon emissions are high right now, controlling uniqueness, so making them higher doesn't actually matter, and the other says that carbon emissions are very low, uniqueness overwhelms the link. So you have to pick and choose. Generally, if you have a link turn plus controlling uniqueness is always a better strategy because it gives you offense as opposed to defense. But sometimes there are arguments that are just sort of true or probably will happen, in which case you can try to mitigate their impact as much as possible by saying uniqueness overwhelms the link. A third strategy against disadvantages is the impact turn. So an impact turn is just explaining why the impact that they're actually talking about is a good thing. So in this case, the terminal impact is probably something that you can't turn. You probably shouldn't say that extinction is good, although some people make that argument. One thing that people have said is that you can have an impact turn to one of the internal links. So you can say more global warming is actually a good thing because it will prevent extinction. For example, one argument would be that global warming would help people in colder regions be more productive, not die from the cold, and increase agricultural productivity, which would prevent extinction due to food shortages, for example, and resource wars. So you can always make an argument that is an impact turn to a disadvantage or to one of the links before the terminal impact. So that's another strategy. An important thing to think about here is that if you're making an impact turn, you do not want to control uniqueness. So if you're making arguments in response to the impact level, you don't also want to be making those kinds of arguments. You don't also want to be making arguments about uniqueness on the uniqueness level. The reason for this is that if you control uniqueness and you say carbon emissions are already really high and making them higher is what the plan does, if that's actually a good thing because global warming is good, you still don't get very much offense because it is a non-unique argument. Because in either world, there are really high carbon emissions. So if global warming is actually a good thing, then that's going to occur in both worlds. So when you're making an impact turn, you have to make sure to concede the uniqueness, the link, and the internal links prior to the link that you're answering. A final strategy in answering disadvantages is impact defense. And this is just the standard argument that you'd make against a plan, against an advantage. If you don't have a turn, or if you don't have strong offensive responses, you would just say these impacts aren't actually that important. So global warming isn't actually that bad, doesn't lead to extinction that much, or higher carbon emissions actually don't lead to that much global warming, or rather, higher carbon emissions are actually not that bad. And then finally, you can make link defense, I guess, as a defensive strategy, as a fifth one, by saying that these links aren't actually as true. Higher carbon emissions don't lead to as much global warming as we think, or global warming doesn't lead to extinction quite as quickly. But otherwise, you would concede that those impacts are somewhat true instead of making offensive responses. So, to recap, a disadvantage is just a reason why the plan is a bad idea. So, it is an off-case argument that says that there's something that the plan does that leads to a series of bad impacts. The parts of a disadvantage are uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact. Uniqueness makes a claim about the status quo. A link explains why the plan deviates from the status quo, and the rest of the arguments explain what happens as a result of that. What are the bad things that occur? Disadvantages are a very common neg strategy that explain why the plan is a bad idea, and answering them is also pretty simple. You can use a link turn, during which you should control uniqueness. You can use uniqueness overwhelms the link arguments. You can use impact turns, and then impact and link defense. And that's disads. Thank you.